On a December night in 1992, in a little apartment in a tiny Texas town called Mansfield, a 16-year-old girl named Marie Robards sat down at the dinner table. After taking her seat, Marie looked across the table and almost started laughing at her father, Stephen. Stephen, who was 38 years old and delivered mail for a living, was 6 foot 4 inches tall with long legs and long arms, and so him trying to sit at their little kitchen table made him look like a giant trying to sit at a kid's table. Stephen saw Marie smiling at him, and he smiled back, and then the two of them sniffed the air and exchanged excited looks. Stephen barely ever cooked, so he and Marie rarely sat down at the dinner table to eat together, but tonight was going to be different. Recently, Stephen had started dating a new woman who lived in the same apartment complex as he and Marie. Her name was Sandra Hudgens, and she loved to cook, and tonight, that was what she was doing. And her Mexican feast she was preparing was filling the apartment with delicious smells. As Sandra stood over the stove seasoning tacos, rice, and refried beans, Marie began telling her father about her day at school. She said all of her classes were interesting and going well, but chemistry was her favorite class. In fact, she said she loved science in general so much that she had started thinking about going into a pre-med program when she went to college in a couple of years so she could become a doctor. Stephen knew Marie could become a doctor if she wanted to, or really anything else she set her mind to. His daughter was intelligent, beautiful, charismatic, and a highly disciplined student. So much so that on the weekends, Marie often stayed in and just did schoolwork while most of her friends and peers were out and having fun and partying. And while this certainly made Stephen very proud of his daughter that she was so studious, secretly, Stephen sometimes wished that Marie would step away from her schoolwork even for a day and just go out and be a teenager and have some fun. And lately, given what Marie was going through with her mother and Stephen's ex-wife, this secret wish of his was all Stephen thought about when he looked at his daughter. Up until just a few months earlier, Marie had been living with her mother, Beth, and her stepfather, Frank, in a nearby town. Marie and her mom had always been incredibly close. Marie often said her mom was her best friend. But Marie's stepfather was a police officer who took discipline and rules very seriously, and so he was quite strict with Marie, which often caused the two of them to argue and created a lot of tension in their household. And their living situation got infinitely worse when Marie walked in on Frank in bed with another woman. Marie already did not like Frank, but now she hated him. However, when she went to her mom and told her what she had discovered about Frank, her mom, who was crushed by the news, no doubt, still said she would not be leaving Frank. This caused a huge fight between Marie and her mom, which ended with Marie moving out of the house and into her father's apartment. Stephen was overjoyed to have his daughter living with him, but at the same time, he knew this was not really a happy arrangement. Ultimately, he knew his daughter just really felt hurt by her mother and longed for things to go back to the way they were when she and her mom were just best friends. In the kitchen, Sandra announced that dinner was ready, and she turned away from the stove and began walking over to the dinner table, her hands full of serving dishes. And right as Marie got up to help Sandra put the food on the table, the landline telephone rang in the living room. They all looked at each other to see who was going to go pick it up, and Marie said she would, and that she would tell whoever was calling that they were in the middle of dinner and they should just call back. But a few moments later, when Stephen and Sandra heard Marie answer the phone in the other room, they heard Marie start yelling at whoever was calling. And after a few moments, even though they couldn't quite tell what Marie and this other person were actually yelling about, it became clear that the other person that she was talking to had to be her mother. Eventually, Marie slammed the phone down and stormed back into the kitchen, her face bright red and her hands shaking. Stephen asked her if she was okay and, what's wrong, but Marie just took a deep breath and suddenly a calm look came over her face and she just said, "I don't want to talk about it." And after a quick glance at each other, Stephen and Sandra simply nodded, and then before long, the trio was back to chatting about Marie's schoolwork and her college aspirations. But as much as Marie wished that big yelling fight she got into with her mother could just fade out of everyone's mind, it couldn't. Because over the next couple of months, Marie and her mother would get into more and more of these types of yelling fights on the phone. And Stephen and Sandra, who often overheard these fights, would always ask Marie afterward what was wrong and was everything okay. but Marie would just continue to ask for privacy and demand they not talk about it. And for the most part, Stephen and Sandra did just that. They rarely pried, and instead just kept an eye on Marie, hoping that someday soon the fighting with her mother would just stop. And by the middle of February of 1993, so 2 months after that first yelling fight Marie got into with her mom, it seemed like that was exactly what had happened, because the angry phone calls stopped, and Marie seemed happier and somewhat back to normal. But beneath the surface, something else entirely was going on. On the night of February 18th, so right around the time that the yelling phone fights stopped between Marie and her mom, Marie was home alone at the apartment, sitting on the couch reading from one of her science textbooks. Her father, Stephen, was out at church, and Stephen's girlfriend, Sandra, was at her own apartment nearby. As Marie flipped through the pages, she heard something bang against the front door. She wasn't sure if someone had knocked, or if maybe someone had accidentally hit the outside of their door, and so Marie just sat there for a second staring at the door, wondering if the knocking sound would start again, and after a few seconds, she heard it again. Marie glanced at her watch and saw that her father had only left about 45 minutes earlier, and normally he would stay at church for hours at a time, so this likely was not him, and Sandra was not scheduled to come by that night, so it likely was not her either. Marie waited a moment, and when she heard yet another bang, she called out to see who was there, but no one answered. After a few more moments of silence, Marie stood up and began walking over to the door, but before she could get there, the front door suddenly flew open, and her father stumbled inside, and he looked absolutely terrible. His face was pale, and even though it was cold outside, there was sweat dripping down his forehead, and his dress shirt was also drenched in sweat. Marie frantically began asking her dad what was wrong, what was going on, but all Stephen could get out was that he needed to lay down. So Marie rushed over and helped her enormous father stumble across the room until he kind of collapsed on the couch. And then once he was lying down, Marie, who was really starting to panic, told her father she was going to get Sandra and she'd be right back. And so a moment later, Marie had run out the front door into the cold night air, and she charged across the parking lot over to the row of apartments where Sandra lived, and then once she found Sandra's door, she began pounding on it. When Sandra flung the door open, wondering what was going on, Marie quickly explained that her father was very sick and they needed to do something, and so without asking any more questions, Sandra just ran with Marie back to the apartment. When they got there, they found Stephen still lying on the couch, but he was borderline unresponsive and looking much more pale than when Marie had left him. Sandra had no idea what was going on, but she knew whatever this was, it was bad, and so she rushed into the living room, she picked up the phone, and she dialed 911. The paramedics would arrive just a few minutes later, but it was already too late. Stephen had died. Shortly after his death, the coroner would conduct an autopsy and conclude that Stephen had died from a heart attack. After her father's death, Marie, who was totally crushed, moved back in with her mother, Beth, and her stepfather, Frank. Even though Marie and her mother had stopped fighting, their relationship was by no means fixed, and Marie still hated Frank. But Beth promised Marie that things would be different this time around, and true to her word, Beth made a real effort to spend as much time as she could with Marie, just like the old days. And for a time, despite the tragic loss of her father, Marie was basically happy. But in the summer of 1993, a few months after Stephen died, Marie discovered a note that another woman had written to Frank, and based on that note, it was obvious to Marie that Frank was still cheating on her mother. But again, when Marie brought this note to her mother and pleaded with her to leave Frank and for them to just go live by themselves somewhere else, Marie's mother refused and said she would not be leaving Frank no matter what. And when she said that, Marie felt like her mother had turned her back on her and was choosing Frank over her own daughter. As such, Marie decided that she could not bear to live with either of them anymore. So in June, just 4 months after Marie had moved back in with her mom, Marie moved out again, this time to live with her grandfather, who lived in Mansfield, the same town where Stephen's apartment had been. Right away, Marie felt totally relieved to be away from all the drama surrounding her mother and Frank. And not long after moving in with her grandfather, Marie's senior year of high school began, and quickly, Marie was fully immersed in her schoolwork and spending almost no time worrying about all the issues in her family. Marie also began going out and seeing friends on the weekends, just like her father had always secretly hoped she would. But as happy and normal as Marie seemed, beneath the surface, this was not true. Because Marie had a secret that she was now starting to struggle to contain. One afternoon in January of 1994, almost a year after Stephen's death and 6 months after Marie had moved in with her grandfather, Marie and one of her friends went back to Marie's grandfather's house to study after school. The two girls walked into Marie's bedroom, took off their winter coats, tossed their backpacks on the floor, and then after talking for a few minutes about school and what they wanted to do that weekend, they both decided it was time to actually start studying. And so Marie and her friend both sat down on the floor, they unzipped their backpacks and took out their copies of Hamlet that they were reading for their English class. Hamlet is a very famous play by William Shakespeare that tells the story of a Danish prince whose father, the king, has died. Marie and her friend discussed the plot and the characters of Hamlet, and then Marie's friend said she wanted to read out loud one of her favorite parts of the play. So she flipped through her book and found the section she was looking for, and then Marie's friend held her book up in front of her face, cleared her throat, and started reading that section out loud. Marie's friend read a part of a very intense scene where one of the characters reveals a secret he's kept throughout the play. "Oh, wretched state! Oh, bosom black as death!" the character cries out to make it clear how upset he is about this secret. Marie listened to her friend read this part, and all of a sudden, she began feeling this pit in her stomach forming. Marie's hands started to tremble, she felt a lump growing in her throat, and then she just started sobbing. Her friend who was reading was stunned, and she stopped reading mid-sentence and asked Marie what was wrong. Marie struggled to catch her breath. Then she wiped the tears from her eyes, and she looked up, and through a cracking voice, she told her friend that, like the character in the play, she too had a secret that she had never told anyone, but now she had to get it off her chest. Marie's friend was stunned at this revelation, but quickly told Marie that she could trust her, and that whatever this secret was, she was sure Marie would be okay, that they could figure out what to do together. But when Marie actually began telling the friend what this secret was, the friend's face went pale and her mouth opened in horror. Marie's secret, which had to do with her deceased father, was way bigger than the friend had anticipated. And if this was true, and the friend told anyone about it, it would make headlines around the country. Based on this wild secret story that Marie would tell her friend, and on later interviews conducted with Marie and Stephen's friends and family, here is a reconstruction of what happened the night Stephen Robards died in his apartment on February 18th, 1993. On February 18th, about an hour before Stephen left for church, a delivery person arrived at Stephen and Marie's apartment with the takeout Mexican food Stephen had ordered for dinner. After paying the delivery person, Stephen put the containers of food on the kitchen counter so Marie could begin eating, while Stephen stepped into the other room to get dressed for church. When he came back out again, he wolfed down a plate of food, gave Marie a kiss and said goodbye, and then headed out the door for the night. Once outside, Stephen got into his car and made the short drive to the church he attended in his neighborhood. He was in a great mood because he always looked forward to weeknight services. There was usually a smaller crowd than on Sundays, so it was easier for him to talk to friends and share in the community experience the church had to offer. When Stephen finally arrived at the church, he stepped out of his car and began walking towards the entrance. Even though it was a cold winter night for North Texas, with temperatures lower than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, Stephen felt warm and sweat was starting to bead on his forehead. But he just wiped the sweat away and didn't think too much about it. Stephen walked inside the church, took off his coat, and began chatting with other members of the congregation who were standing near the front door greeting new arrivals. A few moments later, Stephen had left the front entryway and made his way to a seat in one of the church's long wooden pews. Shortly after that, as the minister took his place in front of the congregation and got ready to begin the service, Stephen's vision began to blur. He felt sweat dripping down his forehead again, and now he was having a hard time focusing, like he was overtired or something. But Stephen just continued to wipe the sweat away and told himself everything was fine. But just a few moments later, he began to feel a sharp pain in his stomach. Stephen winced and grabbed at his midsection and bent over in the pew. The people sitting next to him looked worried and asked if Stephen needed any help. He told them he was okay through gritted teeth, but as he did, he started to feel nauseous, and so quickly he stood up, apologized to the people sitting next to him, and he hustled out of the row and out of the church as fast as he could. Once outside, Stephen felt the cold air hit his skin, but he was still burning up and sweating profusely. The pain in his stomach was getting worse too, but he managed to not throw up and got into his car, turned it on, and began driving out of the lot back towards home. By the time Stephen pulled into a parking spot in front of his apartment, the pain in his stomach had gotten exponentially worse, and now, on top of everything else, he was struggling to breathe. He managed to get his car door open, and he groaned in pain as he stumbled to the front door of his apartment. His hands were shaking as he raised his keys up to the lock and tried to unlock the door, but he couldn't get the keys to fit in, and he sort of fell forward and slammed against the outside of the door. This was the first loud thumping sound that his daughter would hear inside as she studied her science textbook. Stephen took a breath and then managed to get the keys into the lock and open the door, stumbling inside practically onto Marie. Marie helped him lay down on the couch, and then she ran off to get Sandra. Meanwhile, Stephen's throat began tightening up like he was being choked. And while Stephen lay alone on the couch waiting for Marie and Sandra to return, he began to convulse and foam at the mouth. And when Sandra and Marie did return to the apartment, Stephen was no longer responsive, and a few minutes later, when paramedics arrived, it was obvious to everyone in the room that Stephen was just getting worse. And so Sandra, sensing this, grabbed Marie and pressed her face into her chest so Marie would not have to see her father die. Stephen then made one final gasping sound, and then he would die. As Sandra began to cry, Marie pulled herself away from her and just stood there motionless, staring over at her now deceased father. Even though Marie's outward expression showed shock and horror and sadness, inside, Marie felt differently. She was pleased. The night had gone exactly to plan. After Stephen had put that takeout food on the kitchen counter and then stepped into the other room, Marie had rushed over to the kitchen, pulled out a folded-up paper towel from her pocket that contained an odorless, tasteless white powder inside of it, and then Marie quickly sprinkled that powder into the refried beans, something she knew her father would be eating. She stirred it up so he wouldn't notice, and then she grabbed a few untainted tacos for herself, rushed back to the couch, and waited in the other room. When her dad came out a few minutes later, she watched with joy as her dad did exactly what she hoped. He began eating huge quantities of the refried beans. Afterward, he grabbed his jacket, gave Marie a kiss, and headed out the door for church, not realizing he was already a dead man. Marie had poisoned her father, but it would turn out the reason she did it really had nothing to do with Stephen. Instead, it had to do with her mother and her very strict stepfather, Frank. Frank believed it was very important that Marie, whose parents were obviously divorced, pick which biological parent, Beth or Stephen, she wanted to live with. And once that decision was made, he told her it was final. Frank did not want Marie to feel like she could bounce back and forth from one household to the other. She basically needed to commit to one family or the other, and that was it. And Frank told Marie, who was living with Frank and Beth, and so her de facto decision had been to live with them, that if Marie ever moved out to go live with Stephen, then Marie would never be welcome back to live with Beth and Frank. And after Marie caught Frank cheating on her mother, and her mother refused to leave Frank, Marie moved out of the house and in with Stephen. But shortly after moving in with Stephen, Marie had a change of heart and missed her mother terribly and wanted to move back in with her and with Frank. But because of Frank's rule, Frank said no. Marie had been furious and tried to persuade her mother to change Frank's mind and let her come back home and live with them, but her mother continued to stand by Frank and just said, no, you need to stay with your father now. And so this led to all of those yelling fights Marie got into with her mother on the phone that Stephen and Sandra kept overhearing. Marie was absolutely furious and heartbroken, and eventually felt so desperate to find a way to go live with her mom again that she decided the only way was to kill her father, because then her mother and Frank would have to take her back. And so, on February 18th, 1993, Marie poisoned her father's refried beans with a chemical called barium acetate, which is toxic to humans. Marie had stolen the chemical from her chemistry classroom. The reason the coroner had not noticed that Stephen had been poisoned is because in order to detect barium acetate, you basically need to run a special test at a special facility. And the coroner had not thought there was any evidence of foul play, so he had not asked for that test to be run. Marie had gotten away with murder. But nearly a year later, while studying Hamlet, Marie's friend happened to read the part of the play out loud where Hamlet's uncle admits to killing Hamlet's father. And in that moment in the play, Hamlet's uncle realizes he'll never be forgiven because no matter what he does, he will always be a murderer. And when Marie heard those words, "Oh wretched state, oh bosom black as death," she felt a crushing sense of guilt wash over her, and she promptly confessed to her friend what she had done to her father. Marie's friend kept Marie's secret for several months, and during that time, Marie did get to move back in with her mother, until of course she moved out again after catching Frank cheating again, and she moved in with her grandfather, and then shortly after that, Marie's friend did go to police, at which point Marie was arrested. Marie was ultimately found guilty of murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. However, in 2003, she was granted parole and is believed to still be living in Texas today under a different last name. On June 29, 2003, a 14-year-old boy named John and his best friend, a 16-year-old named Mark, were walking in this back alleyway behind a row of shops in Manchester, England. Mark had asked John to go back there, to which John was a little bit confused because it was just a dead end back there. But he went back there anyways because he figured, Mark must have a reason. And so they're walking along this alleyway when Mark suddenly comes to a stop. And he turns to face John, and John's looking at him inquisitively, and Mark just reaches out and grabs him by the shoulder before pulling out a huge knife and drives it into his stomach and says, "I'm sorry, bro," pulls it out again, drives it into his chest before releasing it and letting John fall to the ground. As soon as John hits the ground, he looks up at Mark and he says, "You're killing me." And Mark says, "I had to do it. If you knew all the details, you would understand." And so after only a couple of minutes, John goes quiet and he's laying still on the ground, and Mark would stand there just waiting for about 20 minutes to ensure that John really was dead before calling authorities and claiming some madman had snuck up behind them and attacked his best friend, and you gotta send an ambulance as fast as you can. When the ambulance arrived, to Mark's horror, they were able to keep John alive, and they were able to get him to a hospital where he nearly died twice on the operating table, but he ultimately would make a full recovery. And when John was well enough to speak, he would tell police that Mark is the guy who attacked him, but he had no idea why. When Mark was confronted with these allegations that he was the one who attacked John, he quickly confessed. And the police thought, this is a strange case, but pretty open and shut, and they arrested Mark for attempted murder. When investigators began digging into the motive behind this attack, they, along with Mark, were not prepared for the totally bizarre story that unraveled. The judge in this case would say well-schooled fiction writers could not come up with the plot of this real-life story. And so this crazy story starts 4 months before the stabbing in February of 2003. In February of 2003, Mark was a 16-year-old student who was also a part-time dishwasher at a restaurant near his home in Manchester, England. Mark had okay grades, but even by his own account, he was nowhere near an academic. In fact, he was quite dim-witted. He was very close with his family, who all lived in a very modest home in a very modest neighborhood. By all accounts, Mark was living a very ordinary life. That year, Mark discovered an online chat room for teens in Manchester, England, and it was designed to, make friends and talk about fashion and sports. And initially, when he logged into this chat room, he was just watching. He wasn't really participating. But over time, he became a very active user, and in fact, became totally obsessed with this chat room and basically put everything else in his life on the back burner to the point where his grades were tanking and he was staying up all night. This really took over his life. Also in February of 2013, John was a 14-year-old student who lived in Manchester, England, but not near Mark, and at this point he had not met Mark yet. He was incredibly intelligent and polite and charming, and he was an excellent student, and he went to a very prestigious school. But while John's academic life was going really well, his home life was kind of in shambles. His mother had a series of really crappy boyfriends that always left, and they always left her feeling very depressed, and it was just a very sad environment around his mother. And John, unfortunately, had grown up believing one of his mother's ex-boyfriends was his biological father. And even though this boyfriend had abandoned the family, John at least knew who his dad was. But it would turn out his biological father had actually abandoned him when he was a brand new baby, and he had no way of figuring out who his dad even was. John really wanted to escape his home life. He wanted to just live somewhere else, have an adventurous, happy life away from all the sadness and depression he was around all the time. And so it was in that frame of mind that he discovered this chat room, the same one that Mark had discovered. Although they don't know each other yet, they're both entering the same chat room. John's initial interest in this chat room was not nearly as high as Mark's was. Mark pretty much immediately became obsessed with being in this chat room. John was a little bit more reserved, but his mom purchased a laptop for him, which suddenly gave him 24/7 access to this chat room, and he found himself going on there all the time, to the point where he was staying up all night and even skipping meals just so he wouldn't have to leave his screen even for a few minutes. The main focus of this chat room was supposed to be sports and movies and entertainment, but the real reason teenagers were flocking into this particular chat room was to flirt with each other. And Mark and John were no different. They both really enjoyed, these flirtatious interactions they were having with different girls on this chat room. But John's interactions with the girls was very friendly and wasn't going to go anywhere. It was not really intended to. Whereas Mark fell head over heels in love with the girl he was flirting with, and her name was Rachel. Rachel was a 16-year-old living in Manchester, England, who worked at a gym, and when Mark saw her pictures, he was just totally smitten with her, and he sent her a direct message, not really expecting her to write back. But she did, and she seemed at least somewhat interested in him. And that night, they stayed up all night chatting with each other, and Mark is just over the moon. For the next couple of days, Mark and Rachel were talking nonstop on this chat room. And then at some point, Rachel says, "Hey, I really want to introduce you to this guy I met on this chat. He reminds me a lot of you. I think you guys would get along great. His name is John." And Mark was like, okay, cool. So Rachel introduced him to John, and they hit it off right away. And the three of them formed their own separate chat thread outside of the main chat room. And very quickly, through this separate chat thread that they were on pretty much 24/7, Mark and John would become best friends, and Mark and Rachel would fall deeper and deeper in love with each other. Every time John and Mark were in this chat room, they would use a web camera, but Rachel didn't have one. And initially that really frustrated Mark because he wanted to see his girlfriend in real time, but she said she didn't have the money to get one, and then she said she was shy, and so Mark's getting frustrated, but she says, "Mark, come visit me. You don't live that far away. You can see me in real life in real time." And so initially Mark's excited, and he's talking to John about how excited he is to go see his girlfriend, but then he gets cold feet and he makes an excuse and he doesn't go. Rachel's disappointed, but she asks him again a couple more times if he'll come visit her, and every time he would agree, and then he would kind of chicken out. But after the last time he canceled on her, he finally got the courage up and he invited her to come visit him. And this is when she started getting cold feet. And they kind of went back and forth until they basically stopped asking to visit each other. And they just decided that their relationship was going to live online, even if there wasn't a web camera involved. About 3 months after Rachel, Mark, and John had started their own separate chat thread, a new user popped up inside the main chat room. It was a fairly controlled group, so it was pretty easy to tell when there were new people added. And this individual only wrote in pink text. So he stood out, his name was Kevin, and he told the group that he was a stalker and that he had a foot fetish. And the group thought this guy was pretty weird, but they figured it was just, some kid trying to get attention. They didn't think much of him. But shortly after Kevin's arrival, Mark would get a private message from Kevin that said, "I know you're Rachel's boyfriend and I'm her stalker and I'm gonna hurt her." Mark didn't know what to do, so he just went to Rachel and he said, "Hey, I got this strange email from this guy named Kevin who says he's gonna hurt you and he's your stalker." And Rachel kind of made light of it and said, "Oh, just ignore that guy. I don't know what that's about." And John didn't know what to make about it either, so Mark just kind of ignored it. And then the next day when Mark logged into the chat room, Rachel wasn't there. Now, Rachel always logged in at the same time that Mark did and that John did. It was very rare that she wouldn't be there. And so Mark asked John, have you talked to Rachel today? And John said no. And then Mark went into the main chat room and he asked some people in there if they had seen Rachel or talked to her, and they said no. And that's when Mark went into his email and he had another message from Kevin. This message again was about Rachel, but this time Kevin is saying he actually has Rachel hostage. And the only way he's going to release her is if Mark lets Kevin look at his feet, because again, he has that foot fetish. And so Mark, interestingly, does not go to the police. He doesn't tell anyone about this. He just says, okay, I'll do that. And so he lets him see his feet. And then Kevin writes back saying, okay, I've released Rachel. Later that day, Rachel came back online and she thanked Mark for what he did, but she felt really bad that he had to be kind of humiliated in that way. And she said, you know what, we really need to meet up. We need to see each other face to face. I want to apologize to you and give you a hug. And so they decide the next day they're going to meet up finally in town together. But the next day when Mark went to the rendezvous point, Rachel didn't show. In fact, after this missed meeting, Rachel never contacted Mark again. She just vanished. When Mark got back to his computer, he asked John, have you talked to Rachel? And he said no. And again, he went into the main chat room and he asked around and no one had heard from Rachel. And then a couple of days later, after just continued silence from Rachel, and Mark's really upset about this, he notices a rumor being passed around in the main chat room about how apparently one of the members of this chat room abducted and killed another member of the chat room. And Mark's thinking to himself, no way, that can't be about Rachel. But almost immediately after this rumor was kind of announced on the main chat, people started chiming in that they think it could be Kevin, the guy who writes in all pink, the guy who claims he's a stalker, and this girl Rachel, because they had both logged out around the same time and had not logged back in again. They were the only ones in this chat room that were that inactive. And then after that, dozens more users were commenting that this was actually true, that Kevin had indeed abducted Rachel and killed her. They'd heard about it in other chat rooms and at school, and all of a sudden, Mark's reality is just coming crashing down, and he feels so guilty that he probably could have done something to stop this, and he didn't. But then interestingly, even though Mark was devastated, just crushed by what has happened, he just continued to log into the chat room and acted like nothing had happened. And John picked up on this strange behavior and began kind of delicately asking him, are you doing okay? But Mark made it clear he did not want to talk about it. And over time, the rumor about what happened to Rachel and Kevin just kind of left the chat room, and it just seemed like people moved on, including Mark and including John. Over the next month, John and Mark's relationship really strengthened. They continued to speak in that private chat, now missing Rachel, so they were only interacting with each other in there, and they even began meeting up in person and hanging out in real life. About a month after Rachel's disappearance, a new person popped up in the main chat. It was a woman. Her name was Janet, and she wrote in all capitals, and she reached out to Mark. And she said to Mark that she was a mother of two, she was married, she was 44 years old, she was a real estate agent, but secretly, she was a spy for the British Secret Service. And in fact, she was the third most powerful person in all of Britain, and she was contacting Mark because she was sent to recruit him. She told Mark if he agreed to work with her, not only would he become an agent like her, he would become fabulously wealthy, and he could be her boyfriend. Now, of course, to an adult, this sounds preposterous and sounds like an obvious scam. But you gotta remember, Mark at this time was extremely vulnerable. He's just lost his girlfriend under very suspicious circumstances, but no matter how it happened, she's gone, and he's still grieving her loss privately. And he's just not a very bright person, so he's kind of primed to be taken advantage of. And she was promising him all the things he wanted in life: status, money, romance. And so even though he didn't necessarily believe everything Janet was saying, he wanted to believe her, and so he went along with it. He did not tell John about his interactions with Janet, perhaps signaling that he didn't fully believe it and was maybe embarrassed to give away details, but we don't know. As soon as Mark told Janet he was prepared to work with her, she made him swear an oath through the chat and then told him he would need to go to London for initiation, where he'd be meeting the Queen, amongst other dignitaries and officials. At this point, Mark asked a couple of qualifying questions, namely, how would I explain to my mom that I was just going to suddenly leave for a couple of days in the middle of the week and miss school? I have to give her a reason for that. And she would say, your mother will be looped in on this process. In fact, once you go to London for initiation, we'll be in touch with her, giving her progress reports on how you're doing, and you'll have 2 opportunities every day to call her. Feeling satisfied that this was in fact legitimate, he told Janet, okay, when do you want me to go? And she said, well, there's a caveat. You have to pass a series of tests before you're going to be allowed to go to initiation. This is where Janet explained to Mark why he specifically was being recruited. She said his friend, John, was actually not named John. His real name was James Bell, and he was a very, very important person, but she couldn't say why until he passed his first test. And so Mark's very confused by this, and he says, okay, well, what's the first test? And she says, well, you need to demonstrate you can protect your friend, James Bell. And so I want you to escort him from his school to his dentist appointment tomorrow. You're going to be his bodyguard for 1 day, but you can't let him know you're his bodyguard. He can't know that you know his real identity. So if you can do that successfully, when you get back, I will explain to you why he is so important. At this point, Mark is very committed to this, so he says, yep, I'll do it. He reaches out to John that day and he says, hey, can we hang out tomorrow? And John tells him, yeah, but I have a dentist appointment right after school, so maybe after that. And Mark says, oh, don't worry, I'll tag along for your dentist appointment. And John's like, great, I could use the company. So the next day, Mark meets up with John, aka James Bell, and he walks with him from his school to his dentist appointment, and he doesn't notice anything suspicious, so he doesn't need to do any bodyguarding duties. And after the dentist appointment, the two of them just go to a mall and they spend the rest of the day together. Once Mark got back to his house and opened his computer, there was a message waiting for him from Janet. And the message said, you know, we had agents following you and you did a great job. You passed your first test. Now I can tell you why James Bell, your friend John, is so very important. And she told him that at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean is this big safe that only a couple of countries know about, and inside of that safe is 568 billion pounds, and it belongs to the Queen. But only one person has access to that safe, and that person is James Bell. Literally, his body would need to be in front of the safe for its special scanner to scan him, recognize it as James Bell, and then it would open its door. Despite its implausibility, Mark believed this was real. Not so much because he naturally believed the safe at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean was real, but it was because he totally believed Janet was real. Janet had the ability to know what he was wearing, where he had gone that day, what he was up to. I mean, she seemed to know everything about him, and it's because she told him she has agents monitoring him all the time, disguised as bus drivers and teachers and mailmen, that basically he was under constant surveillance. And she explained to him that that's what happens when you're being recruited. We have agents watch you. So when Janet gave Mark his final test, despite how shocked Mark was at what he had to do, he was willing to do it because he really believed he was doing it for the government. The test was simple. Mark needed to kill John, aka James Bell. And she explained to him that James Bell actually had an inoperable brain tumor and he was going to die any day. And if the wrong country found out about this, they could steal his body after he died and they could use his body to gain access to this safe. And so we need to preemptively end his life, take control of his body, and get that safe open. She told Mark if he completed this test, he would move on to the initiation phase in London where he would meet the Queen and he would get his first paycheck of 80 million pounds and he would officially become Janet's boyfriend. Mark is in so deep at this point, he is fully committed and he says, yes, I'm prepared to do this. And she says, okay, your new name is Agent 47695 and you need to go buy a large knife. She said there was going to be an abort code for this test, which was going to be 6969. And if at any point he hears anybody say that to him on the day he's supposed to carry out this attack, that means it's off and do not do it. So on June 29th, 2003, around 11 a.m., Mark and John, aka Agent 47695 and James Bell, met at a bus station in Manchester. Mark took John down the alleyway that Janet had instructed him to go down to commit the stabbing, and she had assured him she would be one of the first people to arrive on scene. She would be dressed as a detective, and she would ensure he did not get arrested. And so once he was in position, Mark turned around, grabbed John by the shoulder, pulled out his knife, said he loved him, and then began stabbing him. When the police arrived, Janet was not there, and Mark, after giving his statement about what happened, was asking the police officers, when's Janet gonna be here? And no one knew what he was talking about. After John survived the attack and said Mark was the one who attacked him, Mark would tell police, you gotta find Janet. She's the one who can explain what's going on here. But Janet never arrived because Janet didn't exist. Neither did Rachel. Neither did Kevin. Neither did James Bell. Neither did 189 other accounts that Mark interacted with on a daily basis inside of that chat room. And all of those fake accounts were determined to be controlled by one person, and that one person was John. When John was confronted with all these confiscated chat logs that clearly showed he was behind all of these accounts, he confessed. John said he never entered this chat room in order to do any of the things he did or, to manipulate Mark. He said when he joined, he just saw a picture of Mark and was kind of in love with him and wanted to get closer to him but didn't know how. So he created Rachel in order to get closer to Mark, but then became jealous of Mark's love of Rachel. So he killed off Rachel using Kevin, and he didn't expect Mark to believe it. He thought he would pick up that this is all made up when he's involving this stalker that's abducting and killing Rachel. But when he saw Mark totally believed it, John realized, wow, Mark's pretty gullible. I wonder what else I can get him to believe. And before long, he created Janet, who had complete control over Mark. And originally, John was using Janet to make Mark spend more time with John. He was going to be the bodyguard of James Bell, which was really John. When John started to feel guilty about what he was doing to Mark, he realized there was no good way out of this without kind of exposing himself and definitely losing his friendship to Mark, something that in a weird way he really, really cherished. And so he decided that the only way to end this was for him to die. And that's when he had Janet flip the script from protect James Bell to kill James Bell. And even on the day where he was going to get attacked, he had given that abort code. So maybe some part of him thought, I don't necessarily want to go through with this. But he never used the abort code. He was literally prepared to die to protect that relationship with Mark. Mark might have had suspicions that something was up with Janet or even Kevin or Rachel, but he never suspected John was behind any of these accounts. He learned about this betrayal when they were in court, and John is confessing once again to being behind all of these people that Mark had been interacting with. Apparently in court, when Mark is hearing this for the first time, he was just standing there, mouth open, just completely dumbfounded that he's hearing this. And then he would say afterwards, I've been such a fool. Mark was convicted of attempted murder, but he only spent 8 months in jail, and then he was given a 2-month probationary period where during that time, he could only go on the internet with supervision, and he wasn't allowed to enter into any chat rooms. John was convicted of inciting his own murder, which no one else has ever been charged with, so this is a first. And he was not given any jail time, but he was given 3 years of probation, where in that time, he was not allowed to use the internet without supervision, and he also was not allowed to enter into any chat rooms.